Like one of those trophy fish photos. Can make a sweet gun rack like that. And you can see elk have a great big old back strap. Nothing makes you sound like you're from southern Utah, like great big old, right? Alright, so I just killed this bull in Colorado. Pretty common question is, what do you do when you kill a bull in the backcountry? I'm going to need to pull the quarters off of this. I'm going to use the gutless method, so I'm not going to gut this elk. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the forequarters, the back straps, the tenderloins, the neck meat. I'm going to pull out off and leave the guts inside. So it's relatively mess free. So I'm just going to run you through kind of the steps of what I do to take care of a bull in the backcountry. This one I'm ultimately going to end up having to bone out because I've got to pack it some distance. So I'm going to pull these quarters off and end up boning those out and actually putting the loose meat in game bags. You can see he's kind of in an awkward position. Elk are giant animals. You don't always get the best position to work on them in the field. It can be pretty dang tough. So basically what the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a cut down the back of the neck. I'm going to work that up to right here about between his ears. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cut through the midsection. And I'm going to start skinning him forward. The front quarter here, I'll end up going right down the back of the leg. I'll make a cut around the front leg and I'll just skin that hide off. The front quarters on deer species, elk, there's no bones that actually connect to the rest of the skeleton. That's a loose, it's basically a loose hunk of meat, that whole shoulder that's connected via connective tissue on the inside. You can basically run your knife along the inside of that and cut that thing loose, pull it off. The hindquarters will have to do a little bit differently. There actually is a socket, just like your hip socket here in the back hip. So we'll end up having to go through and separate that ball socket and that back joint before we can pull the hind quarter off. One thing to note, this is a part of the process where I really like a super sharp scalpel knife. That's why I like these little Havalon blades. This is a titanium ibex. I like that for doing the hide work because it's super sharp and their hide is obviously super thick. So make that first incision down the middle of his back. Just kind of slip that knife in underneath the hide and you can kind of feel it. You don't want to go too deep. You can kind of feel it with your fingers. What I like to do typically is just use one of my fingers to hold the hide, hold the skin out, if you will, and just kind of run my knife along the back of that hide. You can see when you get one of these scalpel knives, it goes through that thick hide pretty easy. The back of their neck is really thick, that hide, and as you get up closer to their skull, it gets even thicker. So sometimes you might have to pack a number of these blades. But you can see I've just separated kind of the hide. Next thing I'm going to do, like I said, is just make a cut through the midsection so that I can skin down to those front quarters. I want to be careful here that you don't puncture the stomach. He's obviously got a lot of pressure due to internal bleeding. So now I've got that done, all I'm going to do is just start to skin this forward. When I get to that front leg, I'm going to make an incision right down the back of his leg. Right through the armpit. So you can see right here, you got the back of his leg. It's kind of right up underneath his armpit. I'm just going to make an incision. Go right down the back of the leg. And then when I get down here to the leg, I'll just make a cut around the leg so that I can skin that leg off. Blade's already getting a little dull. So I made that incision, I've got that done. Now basically I can just skin off his whole front shoulder. So I'll just start working around the leg. I'm basically just cutting that connective tissue between the skin and the meat. This part can be a little bit tricky. Helps sometimes if you got somebody to help you, or if you can just lean his leg or use whatever you can by any means to help you prop his leg up so that you can get in underneath. Alright, so this shoulder, you can see, if you feel it, you can actually feel it with your hand. You can feel his shoulder blade right here, all the way around, and there's no bone connecting that to the skeleton. So basically, you can either lift this armpit and make this cut underneath the armpit and kind of peel it forward as you go, which is kind of what I like to do. You basically just work behind shoulder blade here and just work it forward. As you work it forward, you can kind of see how that starts to peel off. You basically just work up and around the scapula, around that shoulder blade. There's the shoulder blade. And once you find that, you can kind of just make your cut up and around it. Some loose meat here, but for the most part, you're not going to ruin anything. You're just making that cut around that scapula. So now I've got that front shoulder off. Before I do anything else, I want to make sure that I keep my meat as clean as I possibly can. So I'm going to grab a game bag. I'm going to drop that whole front quarter in a game bag. That'll be before I even bone it out. That's just to keep the meat clean. So I got that done. I got that front quarter in a game bag. A lot of people think you need a saw to do this. You shouldn't need one. Basically what you're trying to do is find that joint where the knee bends. You're just going to kind of make an incision. Inevitably there's going to be some butchers out here that are going to watch this. They're going to giggle, because it can be a little bit tough to find if you only do it a few times a year. You're just going to kind of run your knife around it, find that ball joint. I will say, if I have any advice for this process, it's that it's typically lower than you think. So I think a lot of people probably start up in here. It seems to me to be just like a little bit lower than where you would naturally think it would be. It can be a little bit awkward. Sometimes you just end up having to cut and twist. After you got that pretty well cut, you can just cut those tendons. There you go. Elk hoof. I could make a sweet gun rack like that. So you got a front quarter in a bag. Like I said, I will end up boning this out, but to keep flies off of it, while I'm getting the rest of the meat, I'm going to pull that thing shut. I'm going to use these cords just to tie off the top until I can actually pull it out and bone it out for the pack out. Yeah, so basically I'm just going to skin. I'm just skinning, working my way towards this hind quarter. I'll do it very similarly to the front quarter. On the hind quarter, I'll probably skin to here and then go down the front of the leg instead of the back of the leg. Make that cut and then just skin off as I go. Now I'm just going to make an incision. I'm going to go down to this back leg, and like I said, for this one, the way he's laying, I'm just going to go down the front of the leg, and that just gives me the ability to skin around that whole hind quarter. Here's a tip for you. I got a good friend. One time I was skinning an elk, and I was like getting into it, and you start to see these feather cuts in the muscle and the meat, and he looked at me and said, "Were you raised in a barn?" He said, "Short, light strokes." So you want to be close to the hide. You just want light, quick strokes close to the hide so that you're not cutting those striations in the meat. Inevitably you might get a couple, like I just got a little one right there. But to me, I always try to keep that as clean as I possibly can. And I don't know if it matters that much, but it sure makes me feel better, and I think they're a lot prettier, and I think they're cleaner. So that's my take. They're so big, you know. My brother carries a jar of black pepper. Can of black pepper. And he just dumps it all over the meat, sprinkles it all over. He says that the flies won't touch it. So just like the front leg, I'm just going to make an incision around the hind leg so I can skin that completely off. You always want to be careful when you're skinning. Somebody's going to comment, I'm sure, that you should never skin towards you, and they're right. Sometimes it seems inevitable. I think more than anything, you just got to be mindful. Just like that. Alright, so same thing on this back joint. You're basically just looking for that joint where it bends. Again, I guess the only advice I could give you is to take some exploring, but it's typically lower than you think. Sometimes you just got to run your knife in there and do a little digging and find it. But like I said, you should never need a saw for this. Just like that at that joint. And then it's just basically cutting through the tendon once you found the joint. So you shouldn't need a saw. Throw that over in the keeper pile. So the hindquarter, basically to pull that off, what I do normally, I'll start right here kind of in this joint. Basically I'll just make my cut up here and around. You can see he's got his a bone right here. Kind of have to cut on the inside of it, around it. And basically you're just going to follow the bone, and you'll fill it with the blade of your knife as you go. And make this cut through that connective tissue on the way down. And then you get back to his back here, you're really just going with what you can feel with your knife. So you're just basically going right next to the bone. You'll find his spine. You can feel it. There's a bone right here. You basically just follow it with your knife. What you're going to do is follow it all the way down to that hip socket, that joint. And when you find that, you can basically pop that hip socket out and then pull that whole hindquarter off. You want to be careful that you don't cut into his pea bag or any of his innards. You don't want any of that stomach content on your meat. See them basically just following the bone. Right there is his hip socket. You can basically kind of work it from both angles, so from the top and the bottom, and you're just working your way down to that ball socket. And I guess if I had any advice to give you, it's just with your knife blade, just follow the bone. It's starting to peel right out, just like that. And you have a giant elk hindquarter. I feel like one of those trophy fish photos. Alright, so I'm going to pull this back strap out, which is that muscle that runs right along the top of the spine. It's just like you would be at either side of your spine. He's got one on both sides. So basically what you're going to do is kind of peel off this outer layer of muscle so that you can see this back strap. You can see it sitting right there. So I like to cut this outer layer out so I can see it and get to it easier. So basically I'm just going to make a cut under it, maybe 4 or 5 inches, and just skin it out and then kind of peel it back so I can see that back strap. You can see elk have a great big old back strap. Nothing makes you sound like you're from southern Utah, like great big old, right? If you say great big old back strap. That darn tree, I don't know. So, there you go. The whole back strap, which is basically, like I said, that whole hunk of meat that runs along the spine. There'll be 2 of them, 1 on each side of the spine. Alright, so I'm going to show you how to get the inner tenderloin, which is this little hunk of meat. It's the best piece of meat on any animal. It's a great piece of meat on an elk because it's pretty sizable. So you want to not forget that. People say it's tough to do with this gutless method, and it's not as easy, but it's still totally doable. Basically all you're going to do is kind of cut this connective tissue between the stomach and this hunk of meat that you can see here. Basically make that cut at the end of it on the inside, and it's a really super tender piece of meat, so a lot of times you can just kind of reach in, almost feather it out with your hand. This one's obviously full of blood on the inside. This is not my finest piece of work, but it's kind of the best I can do. I don't want to puncture that stomach. That's not nearly as big a chunk as I'd hoped to get. A little bit of a hack job given the amount of pressure. But nice little hunk of meat. This is the best hunk of meat on the whole animal, so make sure that you get it. Excuse you. Well, my dad was like, everything on the inside has to be on the outside. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, however you can deduct and make that work, that's how you should do it. Just kind of let me figure it out on my own. And it took me almost as long as it's taking me to do this. Alright, so I've got half an elk. That's quarters off, so I've got a front quarter, a hind quarter, back strap, inner tenderloin, neck meat. So that's a full half of an elk. And that's basically how I did it. It'll take you some time. Obviously took me some time. I've done quite a few of them. It still takes me time no matter what. They're just a big animal. They're hard to work with. They're awkward. But that's the steps you take. Now I'm going to flip this carcass over and I'll do the other side. I'll get all the meat off the other side of the elk. I'll get the head off. I'll skull cap him. And then I will start the process of boning out these front quarters and the hind quarters. And I'll take all that bone out meat. I'll divide it up in halvesies and put it in bags, get it hung, and then we'll start the pain train.